We are live, March 26, 2021. Ryan Ray alongside the Honorable Chris Fenton. Mr. Fenton, how are you doing today, sir?
My brain is mush trying to keep up with all the stuff coming out of China. And boy, did I get pulled into a lot of different directions this week because of it. So there's a lot to cover. Let's get started.
Well, first, I know that you were wanting to give a shout out to your old stomping grounds at Olive Garden. So what's going on there?
Hey, you know what? It's not China related. I don't even know if there's Olive Gardens in China now that I think of it. A lot of TGI Fridays over there, but Olive Garden, I don't think I've ever seen. Maybe there is. But anyway, bottom line is my own stomping grounds. If you ever read my book, you know that my first job in LA was as a waiter with excessive hospitaliano prowess. And I saw today that they're raising the minimum wage for Olive Garden servers. So a shout out to my brethren there.
I haven't had Olive Garden. When we moved to Texas, there's not one in the city we live in, but I used to love going and getting all the breadsticks and the salad. Oh man, that was good. So I had to go check that out.
You know what? It drove you crazy as a waiter because a lot of people came there for the endless salad bowl and breadsticks, and that was about it. So you just have to go back and forth to the kitchen nonstop, and didn't really work up the tally for a 15% or a 20% tip. So that was one of the drawbacks of working there. But they did have some good tiramisu, which I took advantage of.
I think there's something
a little too much.
I think there's a part of a chapter in the book about that somewhere. So
yeah,
okay, let's get into it. Let's go to something we haven't mentioned on the show, and I'm going to tweet out a link for those following, one to iTunes and one to Spotify. So you missed the show, you can catch it there. Please take a second to leave us a rating and review. It helps get the word out. We would really appreciate it. Let's talk about Kazakhstan. There is concerns about not enough water potentially in the future, and this lake in Kazakhstan, and it's got an interesting tie to China. They're curious your take on that. But the other thing, Chris, that I haven't ever looked into, but this article made me think about, is where is China on desalination? Is that something that they're pursuing? Because it would seem to make a lot of sense with a country with a lot of water issues that has a large coast to pursue that. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then what is your read on this Kazakhstan issue?
You know, I don't know exactly where they stand on desalination. I can tell you locally here in California, there's been all kinds of pushes to try to get desalination plants up and running in various areas and regions, because we do have water issues in California too. The one huge issue about desalination is that it takes a lot of power to run these things. And that's a big issue for grids that are already strained. And I think in China, as we know, I mean, even with the Bitcoin mining in certain areas, that their power grid is also strained too. It's why they're doing so much building of coal fueled fire plants, or power plants over there. So that might be one of the constraints that's hurting them. I thought this the issue with Kazakhstan, which, by the way, I seem to only think about Kazakhstan when I'm watching a Borat movie or something. But isn't that where he's from, Kazakhstan? I believe it is.
I think something like that, yeah.
But anyway, it's an interesting conundrum. I mean, we're seeing the same thing, I believe, in Myanmar and some other places where water rights, because China seems to be in a spot where they can get those riparian rights prior to some of these other downstream countries. China's just taking what they want and leaving the rest to fend for themselves. It looks like this situation with Kazakhstan is similar. I would imagine it's more groundwater or some sort of tributaries that they're connecting to this freshwater lake or sea. I guess they call it the largest in Asia. But it's causing real issues for the regional neighbors of China. I mean, they're literally siphoning as much water as they can. And what's even crazier is that I was reading on the Bill Bishop thread, a lot of the cotton fields apparently in Xinjiang province are utilizing the water from that very sea.
And the connection there, the irony there would be that the people of Kazakhstan would identify closer with the Uyghur population than the national Chinese would. So you have that playing there as well.
Yeah, I guess that's the issue. I mean, maybe China's saying, "Hey, by the way, we're providing the water to your people." Who knows what?
I guess I'm pointing out is that you have this issue with the Kazakhstan, and when you look at the Uyghurs, it's quite clear that they would identify or align more with the the surrounding neighboring countries than they would with the Chinese. And so the Chinese are taking the water from people that would be more akin to the Uyghurs, using it for the Uyghurs to go do the cotton, which is, slave labor or however you want to categorize that. So it's just kind of a weird setup all around there.
Yeah, and I think what's even crazier or more ironic is that as atrocious as the Uyghur controversy is right now, that's just another layer to add to the check marks on the side of something that shouldn't be happening right now. So anyway, it was an interesting article about those water rights, and it's probably something that a lot of the regional neighbors are dealing with in regards to all kinds of different raw materials and resources. And part of why the Belt and Road Initiative is such a big initiative for China is to get access to natural resources that might not happen to be right next door to them, but to bring them in from other lands. And, that just seems to be the dragon spreading its wing more and more every day.
Okay, well, let's take the other side of the cotton debate, which is H&M and Nike are facing boycott in China over cotton statements. So are we going to be boycotted in China for our cotton statements?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I've gotten pulled into. I've dealt with some senior level executives at some of those companies this week. I just did an interview with a Swedish newspaper this morning about the H&M thing. There's and even consultancy firms and advisory firms are now really getting the calls in regards to what's next for these global companies that are trying to thread the needle between what the West wants them to do and then what Beijing wants them to do. And quite frankly, what the investors in these companies want them to do, which seems to be on the Beijing side of the equation. It is a real dilemma. I mean, it's why I called it the $1 trillion dilemma in my book, because there's really no right answer in regards to the actual agenda and fiduciary responsibilities that these executives have in regards to the companies they run. It's a frying pan or fire situation. I know if you're on the outside and you're in the West, you're looking at these companies and saying, do the right thing. But it's a lot more complicated than that. And it's interesting to see that the day of reckoning seems to be here, which I feel like has come a little earlier than these companies had expected.
Well, and it's coming from the opposite side of the table, right? This was kind of the point, which is if you band together, you kind of stick to it. You might be able to get some strength, but if they're going to pick you off one by one, and you've talked about this quite often, you're going to find yourself on the Chinese side of the wrath instead of getting the U.S. support. And so, listen, for these big executives and CEOs to come out to have a few phone calls privately to say, we're going to say this, we're going to issue a joint statement of the U.S. multinationals, whatever. They could have done that. They didn't do it. And so now they're having to deal with the individual aspect of it, which makes them in a very precarious spot, because what do? Do they kind of walk things back? Do they double down? Do they hope their buddies come to their allies come to their rescue? And, for a lot of the things that we talk about in the U.S. with the free market, and we don't want collusion, there's no collusion for people to come out and to make a joint human rights statement. There's no collusion there. The collusion would be is we're going to fix prices or something like that. They didn't do that, and so I'm sympathetic to the problem that they're in on some level, but it's not like they didn't know that they could have come and now it's here.
Well, by the way, there was no collusion last summer when all the sports partners around the NBA came together on the BLM movement and the police violence movement. That boycott by the NBA drew in all kinds of other partners, all kinds of other competitive leagues, et cetera, to join in solidarity in that. So the same thing can be done in regards to China on an international level, and it's something I've been pushing quite hard. I think if you really look at this whole thing, though, and just sort of the perniciousness of it all and the way the Chinese Communist Party works, it's quite fascinating because they always, like I think I've said before on various episodes, they almost want to keep people as if they're on a bar stool leaning back and almost fall, right? Like it comes in an ambiguous sort of way that no one really sees coming. And the reason I say that is if you look at how this controversy came about, it started with netizens finding these old statements that both H&M and Nike said about Xinjiang cotton. And in fact, I think Hugo Boss and Adidas were brought into the same controversy also that way. Why would those reports suddenly just come to life already? They've been around for a while. In fact, if you go on Nike's website, it's there plain as day. I wonder if they've taken it down or not, but it was there. I posted it on Twitter the other day. It's fascinating because I don't think it was just some netizen that came across those things. I think the Chinese Communist Party knew they were out there. They put them in their little ammunition drawer in case of a rainy day. And then they realized, whoa, there's this backlash that's coming out against the two Canadians that were holding, for trial over espionage. There's this Xinjiang situation going on. There's the Beijing 2022 thing. There's the Taiwan thing. There's the Hong Kong thing. You know what? I think we need to throw a little warning shot across the bow to make sure Mr. Businessman is aware of the kind of leverage we have with this market, and they will be our conduits to all these governments around the world to silence them and say, hey, enough's enough, stop criticizing China. And that's exactly how this thing played out. It wasn't this Chinese Communist Party or Xi Jinping comes out and says, we don't like Nike, we don't like Adidas, we are banning H&M from being on the internet. No, it comes about in this really sort of interesting organic way that almost feels like it naturally came about. And then the Chinese government's just going, oh, well, everybody's speaking badly about this company. Let's remove it from the internet. And let's, see how celebrities start talking about it. Oh, interesting. Every celebrity is now backing out of their contracts and saying they don't support these companies anymore because they're behind the Chinese Communist Party and the way they stand on Xinjiang, and their nationalistic pride overcomes any of this criticism from the outside world, et cetera, et cetera. Like, I know I'm ranting and raving, but you got to realize, like, it is such an interesting, nuanced approach that the Chinese take. It's that game of chess. It's that art of war. It's that keep the competition off balance. Never know when they're coming at you, and hit them with 1,000 different daggers. It's just a really interesting, complete in juxtaposition to the U.S. approach. It's the exact opposite, right?
So let me push back on that a little bit. One of the things that I've seen at big corporations, and I won't say names here, is that you'd go in and you'd say, hey, where's Bob? Like, oh, he got fired. It's like, what happened? Well, it turns out the contractor was paying for his kid to go to college. You're like, wow. And like, okay, well, how'd they find that out? Like, well, he was actually behind on this project over here, and they're really mad. And so they did an audit so they could figure out a reason to fire him. Or, this dude was sleeping with the secretary, and so that they knew it, but they had to do an audit. So they found out that he was overpaying her for 3 years. And so it's in the corporate world, what you're saying is what they do to avoid litigation. They will know of things that are happening. They'll ignore them, but they'll put them in the back pocket. And then when they want to fire you for cause, they will go audit you and then use that against you. So let it go on. So I'm not sure it's really that imaginary. It's what these corporate, I never worked for Nike, I have no idea, but I'm sure they do very similar things. They know someone's kind of on their fringe, they let it go. But then when they screw up something else, they go do an audit and they find all these things that they knew were probably there and they use it against them. So it sounds that's exactly what the CCP is doing here, is that they kind of just storing these things. And when they want to deploy them, they deploy them. So from the U.S. business perspective, I've seen this same tactic used by corporations against employees to get rid of them for being behind on a project or messing up a deadline, but they didn't want a big suit, and so they just did an audit, and they knew all these skeletons were in the closet. So I'm not sure it's really that advanced technique. I see it in the West quite often. I think the thing, Chris, from my perspective, is that these U.S. companies, they got into bed years ago, and I think they underestimated the growth of China, and now they're stuck because what do we do now? How do we readjust now? And so China has been kind of gathering these little nuggets against them, and now they're deploying them. And the U.S. response is, God, dog, our profit margins are based upon all these deals. So I think that's part of what's going on, is that we've just, these, Nike or whomever, they didn't expect the competition to come out so quickly. They underestimated the Chinese, and so the Chinese are just doing what they do to probably people in their own circles.
Yeah, I don't think, having been a part of a lot of those conversations back in the early 2000s, I don't think anybody underestimated the growth potential of China. I think where it's gone and the way the successful companies have navigated that growth is probably very similar to the way we all envisioned it back then. I think the underestimation is probably how dependent these companies got on China, because quite frankly, the developed markets were almost fully exploited and monetized and were sort of static markets, whereas China wasn't. And then on top of it, investors had sort of gotten super exuberant about rewarding companies with great stock prices or multiples on M&A, et cetera, based on how much growth they were getting in China and this idea that it would just continue to grow. And I think everybody got very used to that occurring. And because of that, got very complacent with some of the requirements and demands that the Chinese government was putting on them in regards to continuing that growth or that access to the market. In fact, the Swedish reporter asked me this morning, they said, you know, what are some of the crazy things that have gotten worse over time? And I said, look, you know, back in 2012, 2013, we could actually create a China cut of a movie, not a movie that we censored and was like edited to be shorter than the one the rest of the world saw, but we could actually create one that showcased China or certain things in it and then play it there in that market. Now they're absolutely adamantly against something like that. They feel like anything that their market is able to see, the rest of the world should see too, because that's showcasing something that they want the world to recognize, right? And then on top of it, anything they want censored now, they want censored from the rest of the world too. That was never the case back in 2012, 2013. So the overreach on things like freedom of speech, freedom of creative expression, just in the Hollywood business, is easy to mark. And it can be extrapolated with various overreach that is expanded in every other business, every other category that you can name. And that is where the problem lies. We've allowed this to happen because the beast we fed way too much, and it got too powerful, and we got too reliant on the amazing promise of the market and how entangled we got with it.
No, I think we're saying the same thing, maybe different perspective. The growth I'm talking about is exactly what you're referring to. That China becomes so big that they can look at you and say, well, guess what? The deal's different now. And so if you looked at that and said, well, we expected the Chinese market to grow at this pace and they hit those numbers, and you didn't presume that the power would come along with it, then you're just ignoring what's going on in the room. So as China has grown and they become more assertive in what they're wanting to do, they've kind of repositioned themselves. I think the companies underestimated that was going to happen alongside. And maybe we're not saying the same thing, but yeah, I think we're close to on the same picture. We do have a question though. Let's see here. We were asked by, did it pop up? Nope. There we go. You're muted, I think. Or I'm muted.
Oh my God, that Man United with a good one. Gents, here comes a big one. So put on your tinfoil hats. Suez Canal was done on purpose, ?
He's got more. Hold on.
How the hell just one well, okay. I've been tweeting out those pictures of that poor dude and the one little bulldozer. It's so great. Yeah. Oh man. I don't know. That's a great tinfoil hat conspiracy. I mean, what's insane is there have been some guys that I get fascinated by this stuff really early on. Somebody sends it to me and I got to watch it. And I think a handful of us were sort of paying attention to this way earlier than everybody else. And we probably look like nerds about it. But what was interesting is there were a couple of video footage from satellites showing I think 3 or 4 different container ships going through the Suez Canal at that very time. And apparently there were really strong winds. And you could see the one that's right now blocking the Suez Canal just completely lost control. But you could see other ones that were like waving in and out and looking like they shouldn't have been doing what they were doing. And I'm sure whoever the control tower operator was at the time saying, oh yeah, it's fine to go through. Those winds are only 98 miles an hour. I bet you that guy's not doing well career-wise at the moment. I also find I never really, I always knew about the Suez Canal. I learned about it, but I never really investigated it at all. there's one thing that I find fascinating, which is one side of the Suez Canal literally looks like it's green and pastured and has like mansions on it. And there's like little docks and all kinds of stuff. And then the other side of the Suez Canal is the most barren desert you've ever seen. I'm not exactly sure what the deal is there. Is that, hey, do you live on the other side of the canal? But I find that fascinating. I also find it fascinating that there's that much irrigation in that really desert sort of landscape to have that type of foliage. I don't know. There's all kinds of weird stuff. And then I was also wondering, do they have, and I got to look this up, are there locks in the Suez Canal, or is it all sea level all the way through? Because obviously Panama Canal has all kinds of elevation changes.
Yeah, so I've got a tinfoil hat theory for you, and no one wants to hear this, but once you see those pictures and you realize how small it is, and you realize how easy it would be to clog it, and then you think about the threat of the global war on terror, obviously to clog the Suez Canal, any terrorist could have done that a long time ago, and yet they haven't. So there's your real tinfoil hat conspiracy. Like, okay, we're always chasing these terrorists all over the world, and here is an easy, let's be honest, to get a terrorist on a tanker to sink it in the Suez Canal is not that hard. It hasn't been done. So there's your tinfoil hat. That's actually, when I see stuff like this, I'm like, God, okay, we're always talking about the fear of terror, and here is an easy spot to screw up the world's distribution. You could sink 4 of these suckers in the middle of the Suez Canal, block it for months, and you don't. So that would be my tinfoil hat.
Are we allowed to talk about that stuff, or are we going to get silent? I was thinking the same thing, and then I'm also thinking, God, that's probably the most insecure area of the world too. Like, there's no gates or fencing, and there's no military patrolling it. It doesn't seem like. There's one dude there with a bulldozer that's probably, hey, if anybody gets stuck, you're in charge.
Just put him on the ship. Don't give. Man, you said don't give me any ideas. Listen, I would think that they could have thought of this a long time ago. I'm not the brainchild. I just saw it. I was like, really? I know about it under the importance of it. I've never looked at actual satellite. I've looked at maps. I've never seen from the ship picture, and so it was even smaller than I thought. I'm like, oh gosh, okay, this is all there is.
By the way, and what about, like, if you're Egypt? I know they have all kinds of like issues there and everything with their government and stuff. Like, if I'm Egypt, tomorrow we're raising the charge of going through that Suez Canal 10x. What are people going to do? Oh, we're going to go around the Cape of Good Horn. No, you're going to have to pay it. It's crazy. Wait, China has control of Suez on both ends?
Where have you seen that at, man? You can just link, because I've seen people say this, but I haven't seen it actually sourced. So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I thought the Somali pirates control one side of it. Right. So I don't, and those they go out and those, anyway. I guess we talked about China. So anyway, that story is beyond fascinating. I want to make it part of our lane. If this thing continues longer, we're going to make this Feeding the Dragon and the Suez Canal Conversation podcast. So anyway, it's pretty unbelievable. Well, let's move on to another topic I thought was interesting, is that Hollywood's demise in China, which I'm definitely not rooting for. I'm just I want my peers, my business to realize, like, let's just go back to telling stories, bringing them to the screen, and make them the way we want to make them. And if they work in China, they work in China. If they don't, screw it, and be free with creative expression. Like, stop with the kowtowing. But of course, like Hollywood Reporter, which I love, and Patrick Bresky, who sent out the story, and others and the other trades are, roaring about how awesome it is that King Kong versus Godzilla made $20 million on its first night. And I reiterate that, Iron Man 3, before Marvel was Marvel in China, made $20 million opening day also, and that was in 2013. So number one is the number.
Let me stop right there. Iron Man 3 had the Chris Fenton effect. So like like the fact that they did it without you, I think that's what they're trying to point to.
Oh yeah, you could say that. I will say the Chris Fenton effect probably worked against Iron Man 3. I think that the Kevin Feige and that filmmaking team was all the magic there. But it's not that great of a number. It really isn't. And then on top of it, the financier of the movie is Chinese. It's Wanda, and Wanda is heavily influenced by the CCP. In fact, it's been silenced and shut down pretty much, along with its chairman, Wang Jinlin. So it's got the wind to its back just because it was financed and made by a studio that's Chinese. It's not something that I go, oh my God, Hollywood's resurrected in China, nor is it something that we should brag about, because the more we brag about it, the more we want to continue doing the same crap with the CCP and kowtowing and pandering to them every step of the way. So let's stop that. Let's just make good stories into movies, and let's, the ones that are great, they're going to find an audience there, and they'll get allowed in because the audience will want it, and the Chinese Communist Party will have to let it in.
So I think let me push back and see if we're on the same page here. Here's what I would suggest. When you make a rom-com, like, you're not making that for me. You have a target audience, and it's very clear you got Matthew McConaughey and Reese Witherspoon or whoever they are, and they're going to do a rom-com. That's not targeted at me. I think the problem, Chris, here is that these movies are being secretly targeted for a Chinese audience, but being pitched as they're for an American audience. And that's where you see kind of this confluence of events. So if you come out and said, hey, we're making a Chinese movie that's for the Chinese audience, okay, I can't speak Mandarin, whatever. But when you're saying that you're making an audience for the American, an action movie for an American, it's like, okay, here we go. Get the flag out, get the natty light, let's go. And it's like, oh, well, we changed some stuff to placate the CCP. It's like, well, I'm not your target audience anymore. So I don't have a problem with anyone finding a target audience and pitching to them, good story, bad story, whatever. That's the game. I think the problem here is that we're pretending like we're pitching to one audience when in reality we're trying to pretend we're pitching to a different audience. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, I think there's a lot of accuracy in that, but I think also the mantra really of Hollywood and various other industries and businesses is, if you make something work for the United States and China, which is difficult, but if you can make it work in both of those markets, it will work magically everywhere else on Earth. Okay. So the goal has been, like, in the old days, it was like, make it work in America and it will work everywhere else because we're America. Right. And then it was like, whoa, China has all these special things that they want. So let's try to figure out how to make it work in America and China. Yeah. And then it will work everywhere else. The problem is it's very difficult to placate China and America without it compromising creative freedoms and, quite frankly, spreading propaganda either secretly or in everybody's face around the world. So let's just go back to making good stories that we think work in the West, right, where there's creative freedom and expression and all that kind of stuff that have universal themes and so on. And by the way, we can make rom-coms too that are just good for the United States and the UK and Canada too, and you make them at a different monetary sort of level. But let's just be smart about it and be American about it and stop pandering. Like, we just got to stop. And the money, whether we like it or not, is just not going to be as fruitful in the market anyway. So let's stop touting how awesome it is that it opened to $20 million.
I will throw this out there for Hollywood who's listening right now. I had Random Mitter on Inside the War Room, and he pointed out that, and I don't remember exactly the films, but there is a set of films that were made to portray the Chinese famines in the 40s or the 30s, but they're really about the Mao famines, about all the stuff that Mao was doing. And they were crafty because Mao obviously wouldn't let you make these films about what's going on, people starving in his time period, but they could make them about this prior decade. So if you really want to be a good humanitarian, make a movie for the Chinese audience that's subversive in nature, where it appears that you're praising the CCP, but you're actually undermining. That's the real skill in storytelling. That's the real skill in stuff like that. So you could probably actually make more money, because if you're good at it, people would think that you're actually endorsing something that you're not. And that's what Chinese actually did to kind of get back at Mao during a period of time. I thought it was an interesting story about some of the films that have come out that have nothing to do with America. So that would be, I think, actually a way to make more money and to do a good humanitarian deed.
By the way, I look at a movie like Nomadland, which we talked about last episode, and I'm like, that's a movie that is very subtly super critical of the United States of America. Yet as an American, I watch it and I'm like, this is a beautiful film, and it's a touching character, and the struggles they're going through is horrible, and we should change some of this stuff. Like, I digest it in a way, and maybe it's a little because I'm on the west side of LA and a little liberal or whatever it is. I don't know. But I think any intelligent person would watch that movie and obviously if it's their kind of flick, they're going to go, wow, that was an intelligent piece. It was critical about our system and all that kind of stuff. And I'm glad I watched it, and, interesting message and whatever. China, on the other hand, can't stand stuff like that about their own country. And what's even crazier is that it's all muddied with this Chloe situation where in a way they should be touting Nomadland as a perfect example of why United States is not the place that a Chinese person would want to live in, right? But anyway, I digress. We talked about that last episode. Another thing I want to bring up is probably, these companies we talked about that are caught in the crosshairs of this crazy controversy with Xinjiang province, which is not going away. Unless for some reason China just says, okay, we're sending them off free, look, but Hugo Boss did something that I think no one should try to do in this day and age where digital information is easily available. And what Hugo Boss tried to do was in China talk about how Xinjiang province cotton is fantastic and they love it and they want to continue to use it. Yet on the outside of the Chinese borders, they essentially made an announcement banning the use of Xinjiang province cotton. And that is a great way to essentially create a non-consumer in every market, including China and the US. I just don't know. And by the way, I love Hugo Boss suits. So hopefully they're not going to keep me from getting them every once in a while because they actually fit my weird body. But that is a no-no. These companies are going to have to figure out how to thread a needle without looking two-faced and completely hypocritical, because right now they already are behind the 8 ball.
It's the 80-20. It's the 80-20 rule. You have to be the same person, 80% that you are, 80% of you at the same time, the same place in all situations. The 20% that I showed to Chris Fenton is not the 20% I showed to my wife or my kids or my best friend or whomever. I'm going to say stuff a little bit differently. I'm going to express myself a little bit differently. My core beliefs, they don't change. I might try to nuance them differently on this podcast, I would another podcast, but you can't go from, hey, this is great to, oh, this is bad. If you want to take a neutral stance, take a neutral stance, but you can't have the extremes. You have to have your core values, and you might, when you're in China, you don't want to be disrespectful to your host. You might tone it down a little bit, right? You might not say this is the worst thing ever. I can understand that. You're in China. But then you don't want to come back to the other end of the extreme and say, oh, this is the worst thing ever. You have to be consistent in how you're doing it so that we, as people watching you and evaluate you, can understand what your core beliefs are. In this case, it's what do they actually believe? I don't know. I really don't know, because it's two opposite ends of the spectrum.
Well, what they believe in is capitalism and right.
As far as
the problem is, the problem is they want to be, capitalism that's unrestrained by any sort of moral or ethical code, which now is not allowed. And it used to be not allowed just in general, admitted as a common practice, but it's coming out again. And then, and I think about that 80-20 rule, which I've heard that rule applied to other things, but not about core beliefs of a person. That's really interesting, because last night I had the privilege of being on a U.S. congressional delegation for senior staff, so as chief of staffs and legislative directors, with the Chinese embassy and also the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing. And it felt good being on that virtual delegation, because I saw, even though they weren't members of Congress, they were the senior staff members, and it wasn't Xi Jinping, but it was, essentially the National People's Congress and a certain level that was engaging in this conversation. It was good to see people-to-people exchanges happening between the two superpowers. That to me made me feel good. I didn't get on there and get on some bandwagon kick about some of the problems that I had, but I did see some really tough questions asked. I saw some tough questions slightly answered with party line, and others deferred to, that's not our jurisdiction, we'll ask and get back to you on it. But just the fact that there were exchanges going on plays into my whole mantra and what I'm staying true to with my core, which is a cultural and commercial exchange between the two superpowers is going to keep us away from a Cold War or worse. And the only way to do that is to continue conversations, but we need to disrupt the dynamic between these two countries massively to make it more fair and more healthy for the United States and our allies. We 100% have to do that, and that is going to be disruptive and messy. But on the backside of it, I don't want decoupling, I don't want Cold War, and I don't want war. And people-to-people exchange, like I saw last night, was at least a hopeful sign that we won't progress into that extreme area, which is a real problem for all of us.
Yeah, as a libertarian, Chris, I would just admit that all my conversations are with people that I have disagreements with. And so I can't always, sometimes I have to construct something that's more, okay, well, how do you do this? And so I think we've kind of missed that, I have my core beliefs. And so if I were meeting with a CCP member, I'm not going to be rude to them. I'm a nice person. I try to be nice to people, right? If they're on my show, I'm going to be respectful to them. It doesn't mean I'm changing my core beliefs. I might let them talk to hear what they have to say. And so that's a very important, I'm glad you pointed out, because these conversations, there's a time and a place for all things. And on this podcast, it's our time to kind of get on our ideas, talk through it. What are you saying? Why do you think this? What we think is important? In a different construct, we would talk about it differently. We'd handle it differently, but our core beliefs wouldn't change. You're not going to hear me unless the CCP wants to pay me a lot of money. I'm happy to take that. But like to sit out and go, communism's good. The Uyghurs are, overrated. Like, you're not going to hear me do that, right? I might have to present it differently. And we have to allow for these corporations to do that. And that's an important thing that we don't see from them, though. It's very neutral, or it's these weird extremes that leaves us confused going, okay, you really care about money, so why should we care about your product?
Dude, you're right on the mark. And it's what this country is supposed to be about. It's what the Western Alliance is supposed to be about. It's what free speech is about. It's actually about what being like open-minded adults is about too. So well said. What's crazy is we run out of time with all the crazy stuff going on. We didn't even get to the Russia-China goal of getting rid of the US dollar as the reserve currency. So we'll have to tease for that in the next episode. The other thing is that Alibaba, I wanted to talk about just in regards to why are we able to trade that company here on U.S. exchanges when 30% of the employees are Chinese Communist Party members. The Apple PLA relationship with some of these Xinjiang applications. Taiwan we didn't even get to, which has got all kinds of, there's a lot to cover. Maybe we got to do more episodes a week, but really appreciate everybody tuning in. Our trajectory on audience is fantastic. We're figuring out a new way to do this thing live rather than Periscope, since that's going down. So we'll get that tweeted out for everybody that wants to do that. Appreciate Man United with the great question. We are going to dig into the Suez Canal controversy there and to find out whether there is Chinese influence in that. That would be pretty whack if it was. I know
just the man we can get on for that one. As Chris said, Periscope is going away March 31st. We're presuming that Twitter will give us a functionality to run the show on there. That's our goal. If not, download the podcast. Go ahead and download the podcast. I'll send out a link, Chris sent a link, and it has like the top 5 platforms. You just click on it. If you like Spotify, if you like iTunes, wherever you like it, the top 4 or 5, it's on there. Just click on it. Boom. You can download it. It's in your phone. It's right there. So you never miss anything until we get this figured out. It will be on YouTube. So we'll tweet that out. So you go to YouTube. We will be here. A 5-star review will help us. As Chris said, the show is growing. You mentioned the digital yuan. I can't speak. I am considering a short book on the digital yuan, the reserve currency, and of course our favorite coin, Bitcoin, because I think that is really where the discussion will move to over the next 10 years is the battle for the reserve currency and all these forces and how they're at play. So if you have some expertise on that on the subject, I will leave my email in the show notes. Would love to talk to some people, do some interviews to see what is there. Chris at the Dragon Feeder on Twitter, at Ryan Ray Sr. on Twitter for me. Anything else, Chris, before we go?
Nope. Have a great weekend, everyone.
We'll be back